Because Led Zeppelin had crowds like this. Most bands felt like this about them.
I haven't liked a single thing that they've done. I hate the fact that I'm ever even slightly compared to them.
When envy and jealousy are the order of the day, there's a really short list of bands Led Zeppelin ever felt comfortable working with. Here are 6 bands Led Zeppelin refused to work with, and the shocking reasons why. Starting our list is The Who. In the chaotic landscape of 1969, 2 of the greatest forces in rock history collided on a single stage, and the fallout ensured it never happened again. On a humid May night at the Merriweather Post Pavilion, a young, hungry Led Zeppelin opened for a world-conquering The Who. It was the only time these 2 titans ever shared a bill, and for Peter Grant, Zeppelin's legendary and ferocious manager, it served as a permanent warning. He watched as the tickets misspelled his band's name as Led Zeppelin and fumed when The Who's crew literally pulled the plug on Jimmy Page's amp because the band dared to play past their allotted time. Grant didn't just see a scheduling conflict, he saw a threat to the brand he was building with an iron fist. He realized right then that if Zeppelin continued to play with established giants, they risked being seen as just another act in a crowded circus. From that moment on, Grant effectively placed The Who on a blacklist of partners, orchestrating a strategy of total isolation to preserve the band's mystique. While Roger Daltrey and Pete Townshend were busy turning rock into theater with Tommy, Zeppelin's management worked overtime to distance the group from that world. Grant believed that to be the biggest band on Earth, you couldn't be part of a community, you had to be the entire universe. He refused to let Zeppelin participate in the multi-act festival culture that The Who thrived in, fearing that the primal power of John Bonham's drums would lose its impact if sandwiched between other big names. He didn't want the audience to compare Zeppelin to anyone else. He wanted them to feel like they had just witnessed a supernatural event that stood entirely alone. The rivalry between the camps wasn't just about music. It was a full-scale war of management styles and massive egos. In the red corner, you had Peter Grant, a former wrestler who used his physical presence to bulldoze promoters. In the blue corner, you had Bill Curbishley, The Who's tough-as-nails manager, who famously refused to back down even when Grant got in his face. This created a backstage Cold War throughout the 70s, where both bands competed for top billing, the biggest stages, and the most devoted followers. The irony, of course, was that Keith Moon actually gave Led Zeppelin their name, famously joking that Jimmy Page's new project would go down like a lead balloon. But once the music started, the jokes stopped. Zeppelin's team viewed The Who as the old guard that needed to be pushed aside by something more raw and dangerously loud. By the time the mid-70s rolled around, the refusal to work together became a hallmark of Zeppelin's career. They stayed away from the high-profile charity gigs and multi-band tours that The Who frequently headlined, preferring to stay in their own impenetrable bubble. Grant and Page maintained that Zeppelin was a singular experience, a hammer of the gods that didn't need the validation of a shared stage. They successfully proved that by staying away, they could make their rare appearances feel like a religious pilgrimage rather than just another concert. While The Who continued to embrace the spectacle of the industry, Zeppelin remained the shadowy, exclusive kings of the arena, having successfully burned the bridge to their peers to ensure they remained untouchable at the summit. Now, while you may think The Who obviously weren't big enough to command respect from Led Zeppelin, this next band is proof that nobody is too big to be rejected by Led Zeppelin. At number 5, we have Black Sabbath. By the time the 2010s rolled around, the rock and roll world was practically begging for a miracle. We wanted the Titans to clash one last time, especially when Black Sabbath, the literal godfathers of heavy metal, announced they were finally hanging up the capes. The rumor mill wasn't just spinning, it was hitting Mach 5. Fans were convinced that Robert Plant, the golden god of the Black Country, would finally reunite with his old Birmingham mates for a monumental send-off. I mean, Tony Iommi and Plant grew up in the same dirt. John Bonham was the best man at Iommi's wedding, for crying out loud. The history was there, the stage was set, and the invitation was cordially extended. But then, the unthinkable happened. Robert Plant didn't just say no. He essentially walked away from the entire concept of the rock star as we knew it. Now, you have to appreciate the sheer weight of this refusal. This wasn't a petty backstage squabble or a disagreement over royalties. This was a philosophical divorce. When the invitations for collaborations and farewell events started flying in, Plant remained as elusive as a ghost in a Welsh forest. He made it crystal clear that his musical compass was no longer pointing toward the arenas of his youth. In interviews that sent shockwaves through the fandom, he dropped the hammer, famously stating that he was not a jukebox for anyone's nostalgia. Can you imagine the guts it takes to look at a stadium full of people ready to throw millions at you and say, "Nah, I'd rather play a folk song in a room with 50 people"? While the rest of the world was desperate to see him scream communication breakdown or paranoid for the 10,000th time, Plant was busy finding a completely different kind of magic. He had already pivoted into these incredibly rich, textured musical landscapes with Alison Krauss, trading the screeching vocals for haunting Americana harmonies that actually meant something to him. To Plant, going back to work with Sabbath or even reviving the Zeppelin machine felt like putting on a suit that was 4 sizes too small and smelled like 19.72. He wasn't being arrogant. He was being authentic. He flat out told the press that he didn't even recognize that world anymore. He'd found a new richness in the smaller, quieter places, leaning closer to the folk roots of Bert Jansch than the stadium-conquering ego of an Axl Rose. It's almost tragic when you think about it from a fan's perspective. We wanted that final, earth-shaking collaboration, a heavy metal summit between the two biggest forces to ever come out of the Midlands. But Plant saw the farewell tour circuit as a trap, a gilded cage where legends go to repeat themselves until the fire goes out. He chose the suicidal path of creative freedom instead. He'd rather mess about with his acoustic project, Saving Grace, playing venues where he can actually see the whites of the audience's eyes, than step back into the shadow of the Iron Man's band. Number 4 is very ironic because you would think scorpions leave a nasty sting, not get stung. A group of hungry Germans known as the Scorpions was trying to claw their way onto the global stage. But here's the thing about the Zeppelin empire. They didn't do welcome mats. To the Zepp entourage, younger bands weren't peers. They were intruders. This created a backstage Cold War, where the Scorpions found themselves staring at an impenetrable wall of British arrogance that dictated exactly who got to breathe the same air as the rock gods. If you weren't in the inner circle, you didn't exist. Peter Grant, Zeppelin's legendary and terrifying manager, ran the circuit like a mob boss protecting his territory. He didn't want up-and-comers stealing focus or, heaven forbid, getting a decent sound check. While the Scorpions were touring relentlessly, trying to prove that Germany could produce more than just experimental synth pop, the Zeppelin camp viewed them as continental newcomers who needed to stay in their lane. It wasn't just a lack of rapport, it was a systematic refusal to acknowledge that anyone else was even playing the same game. You didn't just work with Zeppelin, you existed in their shadow, or you didn't exist at all. This power dynamic turned the festival circuit into a psychological battlefield. Behind the scenes, the tension was thick enough to cut with a Gibson SG. Stories from the era paint a picture of a Zeppelin entourage that wouldn't even make eye contact with the support acts. For a band like the Scorpions, who lived and breathed for the camaraderie of rock and roll, this was a slap in the face. They weren't just being ignored, they were being strategically suppressed. Grant and his crew controlled the lineups and the logistics with an iron fist, ensuring that the exclusive headliner status of Led Zeppelin remained unchallenged by any rising European threats. Imagine the frustration of Rudolf Schenker and Klaus Meine, watching from the sidelines as the hammer of the gods smashed everything in its path while refusing to even nod in their direction. It was a classic case of gatekeeping at the highest level. The Zeppelin camp lived by a code of total isolation. If you weren't part of the Led Zepp machine, you were a nobody. This wasn't about the music, it was about the hierarchy. The Scorpions were seen as the little band from Hanover that didn't deserve a seat at the high table. This cold shoulder didn't just breed jealousy, it fueled a quiet resentment that lasted for years. Now we're halfway through our list, and next up is Woodstock. The summer of 1969 didn't just define a generation, it drew a line in the sand between those who wanted to belong and those who wanted to rule. While every long-haired visionary in America trekked to a muddy farm in Bethel, New York, to experience the ultimate communal high, the heaviest band on the planet stayed away. They didn't miss the bus. They set it on fire and drove a private jet over the wreckage. The story of Led Zeppelin refusing Woodstock isn't a tale of a scheduling conflict. It was a calculated, cold-blooded power move orchestrated by the most terrifying manager in rock history, Peter Grant. Imagine you're a festival organizer in '69. You've got the biggest cultural explosion in history on your hands, and you reach out to the new Yardbirds, now Led Zeppelin, to grace the stage. Most bands would have crawled through glass for that invite. But Peter Grant didn't do peace and love. He did contracts and leverage. Grant looked at the proposal, saw a list of 30-plus performers, and felt his blood pressure rise. He realized that if Zeppelin played Woodstock, they'd be just another name on a crowded poster, sandwiched between a folk singer and a drum solo. Grant didn't want his boys to be a footnote in someone else's documentary. He wanted them to be the only thing the audience remembered. Rest of the rock world prepared to slide around in the mud for the sake of togetherness. Grant stayed focused on the brand. He famously told the press, "I said no because at Woodstock we'd have just been another band on the bill." He saw the festival as a trap, a way to dilute the exclusive headliner status he had spent months building with a sledgehammer. He didn't want a 40-minute slot in the rain. He wanted 2 hours of absolute sonic domination. This wasn't about the music for Grant, it was about the hierarchy. If Zeppelin weren't the sun the rest of the planets orbited around, they wouldn't show up. So, while 500,000 kids lost their shoes in the Bethel muck, Led Zeppelin rolled into Asbury Park, New Jersey. On August 16th, the very same weekend Jimi Hendrix and Santana were etching their names into the Woodstock mythos, Jimmy Page was ripping through Dazed and Confused at the convention hall by the sea. They headlined their own show, sold every single ticket, and pocketed the lion's share of the gate without having to share a backstage trailer with 20 other bands. In Grant's eyes, New Jersey beat New York every day of the week because, in Jersey, the spotlight belonged to them and them alone. Speaking of 1969, Woodstock wasn't the only victims of Led Zeppelin's dominance and refusal to share the spotlight. One group found themselves squarely in the crosshairs of the Zeppelin juggernaut, Jethro Tull. Now, on paper, this should have been a match made in heaven, 2 British powerhouses taking over the colonies. Instead, it became a masterclass in how to burn a bridge before you've even finished building it. The tension didn't just simmer, it boiled over because Led Zeppelin decided Jethro Tull simply wasn't on their level. While Ian Anderson was busy standing on one leg and turning the flute into a weapon of prog rock destruction, the Zeppelin camp watched with a mixture of confusion and genuine disdain. To remember, Jimmy Page and Peter Grant were building an empire based on pure, unadulterated power. They wanted to be the only thing the audience talked about when they left the arena. Having a support act that actually commanded attention was a problem. Peter Grant didn't do cooperation, he did domination. Robert Plant later joked that Tull had this right-wing management with an ironclad rule that no one could fraternize with other bands. Whether that was true or just Zepp's way of justifying the cold shoulder, the result was a backstage atmosphere that felt more like a DMZ than a rock tour. Enter John Bonham, the man who had 0 time for pretension and even less for flutes. Bonzo wasn't exactly known for his subtlety, and he made sure the Tull guys knew exactly where they stood in the pecking order. During their stint together, particularly around the shows at the Forum, Bonham started weaponizing his wit. He didn't just ignore them, he actively mocked them. He famously dubbed the band Jethro Tull and started calling them Boreham behind their backs, and sometimes right to their faces. Imagine being a rising star like Ian Anderson, pouring your soul into a performance, only to have the greatest drummer in the world treat your set like a glorified bathroom break. It wasn't just a lack of rapport, it was a total refusal to acknowledge Jethro Tull as musical peers. The final nail in the coffin, though, came from a social blunder that has since become rock legend. Ian Anderson, perhaps trying to break the ice or maybe just feeling a bit too confident, once suggested to Robert Plant that they should team up. He reportedly told Plant, "With my lyrics and Led Zeppelin's music, we could be a pretty good little rock and roll band." Now, if you know anything about the egos involved in 1969 Zeppelin, you know that it went down like a lead balloon. Telling Robert Plant, the man who was currently reinventing the role of the rock frontman, that he needed help with his lyrics was a death sentence for any potential partnership. Plant reportedly looked at him with a mix of shock and pity, and that was that. Led Zeppelin never worked with them again. They didn't just move on, they effectively erased Jethro Tull from their orbit. While Tull went on to become legends in their own right, the rock gods of Zeppelin maintained their distance, ensuring that the only time these two bands were ever mentioned in the same breath was when someone was recounting the time Bonham called them boring. But perhaps the band that had it worst would be the band that Led Zeppelin said no to, even before they became household names. And that would be Iron Butterfly. The Fillmore West in San Francisco is the undisputed temple of psychedelic rock, and the high priests on the marquee aren't some British newcomers. They are Iron Butterfly. They had In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida ruling the airwaves, a heavy organ-drenched anthem that lasted 17 minutes and sold millions. They were the headliners, the top dogs, the guys everyone paid to see. And then, this four-piece from England called Led Zeppelin showed up to open the show. What happened next wasn't just a concert, it was a public execution of a band's confidence. Led Zeppelin didn't just play, they detonated, and by the time they walked off stage, the hierarchy of rock music had shifted forever. You have to understand the sheer, unbridled violence of a 1969 Zeppelin set. Jimmy Page wasn't just playing guitar, he was summoning spirits with a violin bow and a wall of marshals. Robert Plant was hitting notes that made the local dogs howl, and John Bonham was hitting the drums so hard, people thought the building was undergoing a structural failure. They were hungry, they were loud, and they were utterly terrifying. The audience at the Fillmore West didn't just cheer, they looked like they'd survived a natural disaster. Backstage, the members of Iron Butterfly watched this sonic assault from the wings, and the color slowly drained from their faces. They realized in real time that they had to follow that. The legend goes that after witnessing the carnage of Zeppelin's opening set, Iron Butterfly collectively decided they wanted no part of the aftermath. Now, usually, the headliner demands the closing slot to assert their dominance. But Iron Butterfly looked at the smoking crater Page and Plant left behind and effectively said, "No thanks, we're good." They were so intimidated by the raw power and the sheer volume of the British quartet that they reportedly refused to follow them on subsequent nights. They knew that if they stepped out there with their groovy organ riffs after Bonzo had just spent an hour trying to kick a hole through the floor, they'd look like a lounge act at a funeral. This wasn't an official refusal to work together in the contractual sense, but it was a psychological surrender. Bill Graham, the legendary promoter of the Fillmore, watched as the heavy American champions were reduced to a pile of nerves by these four guys who hadn't even released their first album yet. Iron Butterfly tried to maintain their dignity, but the word got out. You don't just pass on your headlining slot unless you've been thoroughly outclassed. There you have it, the 6 bands that Led Zeppelin refused to work with and the reasons why. Do you think they were wrong to refuse to collaborate with any of them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel for more.